in the heart of a fierce blizzard in Bangor, Maine, a tiny German Shepherd puppy named Aiden hangs helplessly from a tree abandoned and left to die. But fate has other plans. Matthew Kane, a man scarred by his past, is drawn to the stormy night and discovers the fragile puppy in desperate need of rescue. As the snow falls relentlessly around them, a powerful bond begins to form between man and dog, echoing promises made long ago. Will Matthew's strength and the puppy's will to survive be enough to overcome the past? Watch now to witness the beginning of their journey. The blizzard raged over Bangor, Maine, its winds howling like a wild animal clawing at the town. The snow, thick and relentless, buried the streets, turning everything into a silent blur. The once pale street lights flickered weakly through the storm, casting eerie shadows on the empty roads. The storm, as if alive, seemed to hold the entire town in its icy grip, wrapping it in a blanket of cold despair. In the outskirts, where the forest met the edge of town, a red maple tree stood tall and lonely, its branches heavy with the weight of the storm. Hanging from the lowest branch was a sight that would haunt anyone who found it. A small German Shepherd puppy, no older than 12 weeks, dangling by a thin wire that cut into its neck. The wire was tight, suffocating the life from the fragile creature, and a crumpled piece of paper was pinned to its fur. The words, barely legible under the wet smudges of snow and rain, read, "No worth. Take." Aiden the puppy had been abandoned in the worst possible way. His small body trembled, barely holding on to life. His fur matted with snow and blood, eyes wide with confusion and pain. It was as if someone had decided his life was not worth living, a discarded thing left to die in the cold. The blizzard made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but in the distance, the faint glow of tail lights appeared through the heavy snow. Matthew Kane, a man who had seen his fair share of storms, both literal and figurative, slowed his truck as he approached the area. The wheels of his old rusted Tacoma crunched on the snow, the engine humming steadily, a stark contrast to the fury outside. Matthew had been home from active duty for years, but the weight of his past was still with him. At 38, he looked like a man who had seen too much. His broad shoulders carried the burden of years in the military, and his jaw, strong and unyielding, showed the signs of a man who had fought through more than physical battles. His eyes, though hazel with specks of green, had the haunted look of someone who had witnessed horrors and had never truly escaped them. He was a man of few words, known for nodding at cashiers without lingering in conversation. He lived quietly, far removed from the life he once had. But some instinct or whisper of a promise long forgotten pulled him toward this particular stretch of road on this particular night. When Matthew saw the figure hanging from the tree, his chest tightened in that familiar way, like the first time he had felt the sting of shrapnel. He killed the engine and stepped out of the truck. The cold air slammed into him, a biting reminder of the past he could never escape. Snow crunched under his boots, the world around him silent, except for the howling wind. He pulled the collar of his jacket tighter around his neck, his fingers numb but steady. As he approached the tree, the beam from his flashlight cut through the storm, landing on the small, lifeless form hanging there. His heart sank. "Jesus," he muttered under his breath. The puppy's tiny body swayed with the wind, each movement a desperate plea for life. Matthew's mind raced. He had seen too many dogs left to die, too many lives discarded like garbage. But this was different. This was a dog that needed saving. And Matthew, despite the weight of his own scars, couldn't walk away from it. He stepped closer, his gloved hand reaching out to steady the shaking body, the cold metal of the wire biting into his palm as he carefully cut it free. The moment the dog hit the ground, it collapsed in his arms, its small body heaving for breath, its eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. Matthew knelt in the snow, holding the fragile pup in his arms. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a deep, aching need to protect. The storm was unforgiving, but he knew he couldn't leave this dog behind. The puppy blinked up at him with eyes that seemed to hold a question, one Matthew couldn't answer just yet. He stood up carefully, cradling the dog close to his chest, the small body trembling in his arms. And so the journey began. The snow continued to fall heavily, each flake adding to the thick blanket of white that covered the ground. The howling wind seemed to mourn, with Matthew carrying the weight of the storm as it battered against the trees. The little German shepherd puppy lay in his arms, shivering uncontrollably, its chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Its small, fragile body felt like it might break apart with every breath, but despite the overwhelming odds, there was a spark of life still within it. Just a flicker, but enough to hold on to. As Matthew stood there in the snow, holding the pup close, memories from the past crept back into his mind. He could hear the distant sound of his heartbeat, his breath coming out in heavy clouds, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere in a desert many years ago. He remembered the sound of the wind shifting through the dusty air, the distant crack of gunfire, the explosion that shook the earth beneath his feet. And then Valor, a sable-coated German shepherd, appearing at his side, instinctively pushing him out of harm's way. Valor's eyes, focused, calm, and steady, had always been his anchor in the storm. Valor had been more than a working dog. He had been his partner, his protector, and in many ways his salvation. When the blast came, it was Valor who threw himself in the line of fire, taking the brunt of the explosion meant for Matthew. The memory of Valor's sacrifice surged through him, sharp and painful. He hadn't been the same after that. Valor's death had left a hole in Matthew's heart that no amount of time or distance could fill. The war had taken its toll on him in more ways than he could count, but it was Valor's loss that had left him feeling hollow. He had promised that no one would be left behind. Valor had given everything for him, and Matthew hadn't been able to give anything in return. But now, holding this tiny puppy, the promise he had made so long ago stirred in his chest once more. This one. I'm not leaving you behind either, Matthew whispered to the pup, his voice rough with emotion. The puppy's small head lifted slightly, and its wide amber eyes locked onto his, full of confusion, fear, and, just barely, hope. It wasn't much, but Matthew saw it, and he knew the dog was still fighting to stay alive. He couldn't help but feel a deep connection. This was the same spirit Valor had shown, a fight to live no matter the odds. Matthew knew what he had to do. He couldn't let Aiden die out here in this storm, just like Valor had never let him die in that foreign desert. No, this was different. This dog had a chance, and Matthew wasn't about to let that slip away. With careful hands, he shifted Aiden so that he was cradling the puppy against his chest, keeping the dog close to his warmth. The snow continued to fall, but in the calm of the moment, Matthew felt a sense of purpose return, a feeling that had eluded him for years. Aiden was fragile, his body still too weak to move, but in those eyes that reminded him so much of Valor, Matthew saw something he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. He turned and walked toward his truck. Aiden wrapped tightly in his jacket, the small body pressed against his chest. Every step felt like a decision, like he was choosing to step back into the world he had left behind, the world of camaraderie, loyalty, and the responsibility of protecting others. Once inside the truck, Matthew gently placed Aiden on the passenger seat, covering him with a blanket to keep the warmth in. The engine rumbled to life, and Matthew drove slowly through the snow-covered roads, his hands gripping the wheel with newfound determination. He glanced down at Aiden every few seconds, noticing how the puppy's breathing was still shallow but steady. Aiden's tiny body was still weak, but as Matthew drove, he could feel the puppy growing warmer, the trembling starting to subside. Matthew's heart began to heal in small, imperceptible ways. This wasn't just about saving a dog, it was about saving a part of himself. And as the snowflakes swirled outside, Matthew couldn't help but feel that for the first time in years he was no longer alone in this fight. Matthew kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts kept returning to the small bundle next to him. Aiden, still fragile and weak, lay on the passenger seat, wrapped in the blanket, his tiny body curled into the warmth that Matthew tried to provide. The cold wind from the storm outside pressed against the truck's windows, but inside Matthew kept the heat running, watching as Aiden's chest rose and fell with every shallow breath. Every few seconds, Matthew glanced down, making sure the puppy was still breathing. The quiet thrum of the engine was almost comforting against the stillness of the night. He kept his hand close to Aiden, resting it on the seat, the warmth from his fingers radiating into the dog's small, trembling form. It was the kind of quiet comfort that had always eluded him, the kind that came with knowing someone or something depended on you. The truck's tires slid over the icy road as Matthew maneuvered carefully through the snow. The storm was still howling, but the worst of it seemed to be behind them. He didn't want to drive too fast, not with Aiden in such a fragile state. The poor dog had been through enough, and Matthew wasn't going to rush the journey back. He drove slower than usual, paying attention to every detail, the faintest signs of the road, as if he were walking a tightrope. Aiden shifted slightly, a soft whimper escaping the puppy's throat. Matthew's heart clenched. The puppy was still so weak, its bones too small and its body far too fragile to withstand the world it had been thrust into. But it wasn't giving up. The way Aiden's eyes fluttered open, even for the briefest moments, told Matthew that the dog still had the will to survive. They made their way through the town, the snow drifting more lightly, now falling in soft layers as the night deepened. Matthew pulled into a small, run-down cabin on the outskirts of Bangor, far enough away from the town center to be isolated, but close enough that he could get help if needed. It wasn't much, a tiny place with a sagging porch and a single furnace that seemed to cough more than it heated, but it was home. At least for now it was. He carefully carried Aiden inside the puppy's small body, tucked securely against his chest, feeling the warmth from the truck dissipate into the cold night air. Inside, the faint smell of old wood and damp carpet greeted him, and he quickly set the puppy down on a worn blanket by the old stove. Matthew checked the small first aid kit he had stashed away in the corner of the cabin and began tending to Aiden's wounds. He cleaned the puppy's fur and applied some ointment to the bruising and cuts. The wire around Aiden's neck had left a raw mark that still bled lightly, but it seemed to be healing. The puppy stirred as Matthew worked, and for the first time the tiniest sign of trust appeared in Aiden's eyes. The trembling had slowed, though it still wasn't gone. Matthew sat by the puppy, his hand gently resting on the dog's ribs, feeling the soft rise and fall of each breath. He let out a sigh, a mix of exhaustion and relief. As the night wore on, Matthew kept vigil over Aiden, making sure the puppy was comfortable, constantly adjusting the blanket and the heat. The fire crackled in the stove, adding a faint orange glow to the room, and Matthew leaned back against the wall, his eyes never leaving the small, fragile dog. In those moments, he realized something. Aiden, with all his fragility and fear, was the light in Matthew's life right now. The puppy had been abandoned, just like Matthew had been in some ways. Left alone in the storm, forgotten. But now they were together, and for the first time in a long while, Matthew felt something that was missing purpose. Aiden's body slowly began to relax, the fear that had gripped him earlier easing into the warmth of the cabin. His small body was still weak, but the spark of life was there, bright and steady. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the room, the warm glow casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Matthew sat on the edge of the worn-out chair, his eyes fixed on the small form of Aiden curled up on the blanket. The puppy was finally resting peacefully, the tremors that had racked its tiny body slowly fading away. But despite the quiet comfort of the cabin, Matthew felt a heaviness in his chest, a weight he couldn't shake. His mind wandered back to a time he tried to forget. The heat of the desert, the thick oppressive air, and the constant hum of tension that filled every corner of his existence. He remembered the roar of explosions, the thunder of gunfire, and the fear that came with each step forward, knowing the next could be his last. But more than anything, he remembered Valor. Valor, his canine partner, had been his constant companion through it all. A German shepherd with the heart of a warrior, a dog that had saved his life more times than Matthew cared to count. Valor had been more than just a dog. He had been a brother, a lifeline in the chaos of war. They had fought side by side, and when the worst came, when an IED exploded beneath them, Valor had shielded Matthew with his body, taking the brunt of the blast meant for him. Matthew still remembered the moment, the blast that threw him to the ground, the feeling of the earth shaking beneath him, and then the silence that followed. The pain was unbearable, but it wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was the image of Valor lying motionless in the sand, his noble head resting at Matthew's side, the blood that soaked the desert ground. Valor had given everything for him, and Matthew had never been able to repay that sacrifice. The memory was sharp like a knife digging into his chest, and no matter how many years had passed, it still felt like it had happened yesterday. The ghosts of war were always there, lurking in the corners of his mind, never fully allowing him to escape the past. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the dark, the nightmares would come. The flashes of violence, the screams of fallen comrades, and the face of Valor staring at him with those loyal, loving eyes. But tonight, something was different. As he sat in the dim light watching Aiden's small, fragile form, Matthew felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of peace, even if it was fleeting. Aiden, with his deep, trusting eyes and quiet determination, reminded him so much of Valor. The way the puppy had looked at him earlier when their eyes met, it had felt like a moment of connection, like a bond being forged in the silence. Aiden wasn't just any dog, there was something special about him. Matthew's fingers clenched around the arm of the chair, the familiar tension returning to his shoulders. The past was never truly gone, no matter how much he wanted to forget it. But tonight, as the snow continued to fall softly outside and the storm's fury began to fade, Matthew found himself letting go, if only for a moment. Aiden was here now, and the puppy was a reminder of the promises Matthew had made long ago. Promises to protect, to serve, and to never let another soul be abandoned. The storm outside seemed to match the chaos inside his mind, the winds howling as if echoing his inner turmoil. But Aiden, with his quiet presence, was like a calm in the middle of it all, a light in the darkness. For the first time in a long time, Matthew felt like he wasn't alone in his fight. As the hours passed, Matthew remained seated by the fire, his eyes never leaving Aiden. The small puppy lay curled on the blanket, its fragile form still, but the steady rise and fall of its chest was a sign of hope. Aiden was fighting just like Matthew had once fought. And in that fight, Matthew saw the reflection of his own struggles, his own battles with the ghosts of the past. Sitting there, his mind drifted back to a time before the scars of war had carved themselves into his soul. He remembered the day he left the military, the weight of his gear heavy not just on his shoulders but in his heart. The last thing his commanding officer had told him was the same thing they had all been taught in training: no one gets left behind. It had been more than a phrase. It was a creed, a vow, a promise made to every soldier, every dog and every human who fought alongside them. The promise had been clear. No matter the cost, no matter the danger, you never leave anyone behind. Valor had been his partner in the truest sense. The bond they shared was something Matthew couldn't explain. Valor had not only been a soldier in his own right, but had become Matthew's anchor in the chaos of war. The day Valor had shielded him from the blast, sacrificing his own life to save Matthew, the promise of no one gets left behind had become a crushing reality. Valor had given everything. Matthew was left with nothing but guilt, and now Aiden lay before him, a tiny creature that had been abandoned, left to die in the storm, the same way Matthew had been left alone after Valor's death. The promise he had made, the one he had failed to keep all those years ago, loomed over him. But now, as he looked at Aiden, he realized he still had a chance to honor the vow he had broken. He could protect this dog. He could be the one to save him, just as Valor had once saved him. Matthew's fingers brushed through Aiden's fur, feeling the delicate warmth of the small body beneath his touch. It was a quiet promise, unspoken, but felt deeply. He would not let this puppy die, not like this. Aiden deserved more than to be left alone in the snow, abandoned and forgotten. And Matthew, for the first time in a long time, felt the fire of his old commitment reignite within him. Aiden was different, but in so many ways the puppy reminded Matthew of Valor. There was something in Aiden's eyes, something unspoken but deeply understood, a quiet strength, a will to survive. It was as though Aiden knew in some small part that this wasn't just about surviving the storm. This was about a bond, an unspoken connection that Matthew could feel even now in the silent hours of the night. Matthew stood carefully, lifting Aiden in his arms, feeling the weight of the small body against his chest. The puppy stirred slightly, but didn't pull away, trusting him. Matthew felt a pang in his heart as he thought of Valor and the promise he had made. This time there would be no failure. This time he would keep his word. The snowstorm outside still raged, but inside the cabin there was a quiet determination settling in Matthew's heart. This was his chance to fulfill the vow he had made so long ago. He would not leave Aiden behind. Not now, not ever. The warmth of the cabin felt like a fragile shield against the bitter cold of the world outside, but within Matthew the storm raged just as fiercely. He sat in the dim light of the room, Aiden nestled carefully in his lap, the small puppy now warm and asleep. The crackle of the fire was comforting, but Matthew's mind couldn't escape the relentless pull of memories that seemed to come alive in the quiet darkness. The images came unbidden. The flashes of gunfire, the acrid smell of dust and smoke, the deafening explosions, and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The nightmares were always the same. The faces of his comrades, men who had fought beside him, laughed with him, and died beside him. He could still see their faces in his mind's eye, hear their voices calling out in the chaos of war. But the one image that haunted him more than any other was Valor. Valor had been more than a dog to Matthew. He had been his partner in the truest sense. The bond they shared was something few could understand, something that went beyond words. When Valor had sacrificed himself, throwing himself in the line of fire to save Matthew from an explosion, Matthew had lost more than just a companion. He had lost a piece of himself. The guilt was suffocating, the feeling of helplessness overwhelming. Valor had given everything for him, and Matthew hadn't been able to do anything in return. Every night the guilt clawed at him. It was the same guilt that lingered when the flashbacks came, when the faces of the fallen soldiers he couldn't save, couldn't protect, stared back at him from the darkness. Every scream, every cry for help felt like it was his fault. He had sworn to protect them, to never leave anyone behind, but they were gone, and he was left with the burden of their loss. Aiden shifted slightly in his arms, his small body stirring as if sensing the tension in Matthew. The puppy's eyes opened just slightly, and for a moment Matthew looked into those deep amber eyes. In them he saw something familiar, a quiet strength, a will to survive. Aiden wasn't just a reminder of the guilt Matthew carried. He was a living testament to survival, to the will to keep going even when everything seemed lost. Matthew closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to push the memories back. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Slowly, Aiden snuggled closer, his head resting against Matthew's chest. The warmth from the puppy's small body seeped into him, and for the first time in days, the weight on his chest lightened, even if just a little. Aiden had been through so much, yet he still fought. He was small and fragile, but he had a spirit that wouldn't break. And as Matthew sat there holding the puppy close, he realized that this little dog, with all his fears and wounds, was slowly healing him. In the quiet of the cabin, Aiden was helping Matthew confront the darkness that had followed him home. The nightmares would come again. Matthew knew. They always did. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't facing them alone. Aiden was here, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there was a chance for redemption, a chance for healing. Days passed in the quiet cabin, and slowly Matthew began to see the signs of life returning to Aiden. The small puppy, once a fragile creature trembling from the cold and pain, was beginning to show the faintest traces of strength. His breathing, once shallow and weak, was becoming more regular. The small wounds that had marred his body started to heal, and though Aiden was still far from strong, there was a quiet determination in his eyes. Matthew continued to care for him, tending to his every need with the same attention and precision he had used to care for his own wounds. He made sure Aiden had enough to eat, though the puppy's appetite was still small, and he kept him warm by the fire, wrapping him in blankets to ensure he wasn't exposed to the harsh cold that still lingered outside. Each day, Matthew felt a small shift, A subtle improvement in Aiden's condition, and with each sign of growth, Matthew felt a glimmer of hope begin to flicker inside him. The bond between them deepened as Matthew tended to Aiden, his movements becoming more instinctive. He talked to the puppy in quiet murmurs, telling him about the past, about valor, and about the things he had seen and lost. And though Aiden couldn't understand the words, he seemed to listen, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of Matthew's voice, his eyes following Matthew's movements, as if understanding the comfort in his presence. Then one morning, as the sunlight broke through the window, casting a soft glow across the cabin, Aiden did something Matthew had been hoping for. The puppy, weak but eager, pushed himself up onto his shaky legs, his small body trembling with effort. Matthew watched with bated breath as Aiden took a tentative step forward, wobbling slightly, then another and another. Aiden moved a little further away from his blanket, each step more confident than the last. And then, just as Matthew's heart swelled with pride, Aiden broke into a small, wobbly run, his clumsy paws carrying him across the floor with more excitement than grace. The sight of the little dog, who had been so broken, so fragile, moving on his own for the first time, brought a flood of emotion to Matthew. A smile, soft and full of wonder, spread across his face as he watched Aiden chase after a ball he had rolled across the floor, the puppy's tail wagging weakly behind him. It was a small victory, but to Matthew it felt monumental. Aiden had survived the storm, and now he was beginning to live again. Matthew crouched down beside the puppy, his hands trembling as he reached out to pet Aiden's head, feeling the warmth of the dog's soft fur under his fingertips. "You're going to be all right, buddy," Matthew murmured, his voice thick with emotion. The words were simple, but they held all the promises Matthew had made to Valor, to himself, and now to Aiden. As Aiden continued to play, chasing the ball and tumbling over in his excitement, Matthew knew this was just the beginning. Aiden had a long road ahead of him, but the puppy's strength, his willingness to keep going, gave Matthew something he hadn't realized he had been missing, a reason to keep moving forward, too. The days following Aiden's first steps were filled with small triumphs. Each day the puppy grew stronger, more confident, his tiny body slowly regaining its vitality. Matthew found himself caught in a routine of caring for Aiden, watching over him as the puppy learned to trust him more and more. The bond between them deepened, and Matthew couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of responsibility for this little creature who had come into his life when he needed it most. However, as the days turned to weeks, a nagging feeling began to creep into the back of Matthew's mind. There was something about Aiden that didn't quite add up. While the puppy had made remarkable progress, it was as if something was holding him back from being just another rescue dog. The way Aiden reacted to certain sounds, the way he seemed to know when Matthew was on edge, it was almost like the dog was waiting for something or someone. It was a crisp morning when Matthew's suspicions began to turn into something more tangible. He was out in the yard tossing a stick for Aiden when a truck pulled slowly down the gravel road toward his cabin. Matthew squinted, the truck's headlights cutting through the early morning fog. He watched it approach, his instincts prickling with unease. The truck was old, its engine sputtering as it rolled to a stop near his property. Matthew straightened, his heart racing. There was something about the way the truck had moved, too slow, too deliberate. The engine cut off, and from the cab 2 men climbed out. They were dressed in nondescript clothing, but there was an air of authority about them, something that made Matthew's stomach twist in warning. Aiden, who had been happily bounding around, suddenly froze. His ears perked, and he turned his head toward the men, his body going stiff. Matthew watched the puppy, a cold knot forming in his gut. The way Aiden reacted, it wasn't just a dog being cautious around strangers. It was the reaction of someone who recognized danger. The men made no move toward Matthew at first. Instead, they stood by their truck, surveying the area with careful eyes. One of them glanced in Matthew's direction, and when their gazes met, the stranger's face remained unreadable. The silence between them stretched long, and Matthew felt his hand tighten around the shovel he had been holding. Finally, one of the men began walking toward him, a calm, measured pace. "You've got a dog there," the man said, his voice low but commanding. Matthew instinctively stepped forward, positioning himself between the man and Aiden, who had now retreated behind Matthew's legs. "Who are you?" Matthew's voice was steady, but the unease in his gut grew with every second. He couldn't explain it, but there was something about these men that felt wrong. "We're just looking for a dog," the stranger said, eyes flicking briefly to Aiden. "A German shepherd about this size. We believe it might be here." Matthew's pulse quickened. The words hung in the air like a warning bell. He had no idea who these men were, but the way they looked at Aiden, their eyes narrowing as they inspected the puppy, made Matthew's heart pound in his chest. "That's not your business," Matthew said, his tone sharper now, a protective instinct rising within him. Aiden had only just begun to trust again, and these men, whoever they were, weren't going to take him. The man smiled, though there was nothing kind in it. "We'll be back," he said, nodding toward the truck. With a flick of his wrist, the men turned and left, retreating back into the vehicle, which started up and sped off down the road. Matthew stood there, his body tense. The danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. He looked down at Aiden, who had returned to his side, his tiny body still shaking, but with an unmistakable look of fear in his eyes. Matthew knew something had changed. He hadn't imagined the look in the men's eyes, and he knew deep down that Aiden was more than just a stray pup. There was something they weren't telling him, something he hadn't yet uncovered about Aiden's past. Matthew stood at the edge of his porch, watching as the truck disappeared down the snow-covered road. His mind raced, piecing together the strange encounter. The men's cold, calculating eyes, their cryptic words. They hadn't been searching for just any dog. They were looking for Aiden. The sense of dread that had begun to settle in Matthew's chest deepened. There was something about this puppy that he still didn't understand, and those men were far from the only ones who seemed to know more than they let on. After a long moment, Matthew turned back to the cabin, his footsteps heavy in the snow. He glanced down at Aiden, who was still by his side, trembling slightly from both the cold and fear. It broke Matthew's heart to see the little dog so scared, yet he couldn't ignore the truth staring him in the face. Aiden's past was far darker than he had imagined. As Matthew entered the cabin, he went straight to the small medical kit he kept near the door. He had been treating Aiden's wounds for days now, cleaning up the puppy's scrapes, bruises, and the deep gash around his neck. But today Matthew's gaze lingered a little longer. The mark on Aiden's throat where the wire had been was healing but still raw. Matthew gently stroked the area, feeling the faint outline of something underneath the skin. His fingers brushed against something hard, smooth and small. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He gently pressed against the spot again, and there it was, a small object beneath Aiden's skin. He knew exactly what it was. Matthew carefully fetched a pair of tweezers from the kit and with the gentlest touch began to probe around the small bump. After a few minutes of careful work, the microchip emerged, covered in dirt and blood. As he held the small chip in his hand, Matthew felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. He had no doubt that this was the key to understanding Aiden's past, but there was one problem. It was damaged. The numbers etched into the microchip were barely visible, smudged and incomplete. Matthew tried to make sense of the fragmented code, but there was nothing he could do. The information was lost, purposefully erased. Whoever had abandoned Aiden had gone to great lengths to hide the truth. Matthew's mind flashed back to the two men who had come looking for Aiden, the way they had seemed to recognize him, the way they had spoken about the dog as if they knew exactly who he was. It all pointed to one thing: Aiden wasn't just any stray. This dog was a part of something bigger. He had been someone's property, and now someone wanted him back. His anger surged. The thought of someone, anyone, treating Aiden with cruelty, using him as nothing more than an object to be discarded when no longer useful, made Matthew's blood boil. He turned the chip over in his hand, his fingers tightening around it. Aiden's past was a mystery, and Matthew was determined to uncover it. Whoever had hurt Aiden, whoever had erased his identity, they would answer for it. Matthew had made a promise when he took Aiden in. He would protect him no matter what, and that meant finding out exactly who was after him and why. As he looked down at Aiden, who was now curled up in the corner of the room, Matthew felt a renewed sense of purpose. Aiden had already been through so much, but the little dog was still fighting, still trusting, and for that Matthew would fight too. The following days were filled with a constant undercurrent of tension. Matthew could feel it in the pit of his stomach, the nagging sensation that something was wrong, that the quiet life he had hoped to rebuild was being slowly disrupted. He had been careful, staying away from town and keeping to himself, but the feeling of being watched never left. There were moments when he thought he saw a figure in the distance, a shadow passing by, or when he heard the faint hum of a car idling nearby, only to turn and find nothing. It wasn't just paranoia. It was real. He knew it. Aiden, though still recovering, seemed to sense it too. The puppy, usually calm and curious, had begun to react differently. He would freeze his body tense, his ears pricked, every sense alert to something Matthew couldn't see. It was as if Aiden knew instinctively that the danger wasn't over. Matthew's thoughts kept circling back to the men who had come looking for Aiden, their presence, the way they had watched him so intently, their cryptic words. There was more to it than just a stray dog. And then there was the microchip erased, hidden, a deliberate attempt to erase Aiden's identity. That wasn't something someone did to an ordinary dog. Aiden was special, perhaps more than even Matthew realized. It hit him suddenly like a jolt. Aiden wasn't just any dog. He wasn't a simple stray that had been abandoned. This dog had been trained, conditioned for something far bigger. Matthew's mind raced with the implications. Aiden could be a part of something military, something covert, something no one was meant to know. Matthew knew enough about the world of military contracts and classified programs to recognize the signs. He had seen the way some special operations used K-9 units, how they were treated as assets rather than companions. Was Aiden part of such a program? Had he been trained for something more sinister, only to be discarded when his usefulness had run out? The weight of this realization settled in Matthew's chest. The same military precision that had marked Valor's training was the same kind of training Aiden might have gone through. The idea that someone would treat a living creature as a mere tool was infuriating. But the fact that Aiden was here alive and fighting meant one thing. He was far more than just a pawn in someone else's game. Aiden had already survived the worst, and now it was Matthew's turn to protect him. But how Matthew didn't have the connections or the resources to take on whatever organization might be after Aiden. He couldn't fight an entire network of people in the shadows. He needed help. His mind turned to Eleanor, his old friend and the town's veterinarian. She had always been someone Matthew could trust. More than that, she knew more about animals than anyone else. If anyone could help him piece together Aiden's past, it was her. Matthew had always kept his distance from her since his return to Bangor. He had pushed away everyone who had tried to get close to him, but he couldn't ignore it anymore. He needed answers, and he needed someone who understood the complexities of animal behavior, of training and conditioning. If Aiden had been part of some secret military program, Eleanor could help him figure out where to go next. As Matthew paced the cabin, looking down at Aiden as the puppy curled up to sleep, the decision was made. He couldn't do this alone. The moment Matthew walked into Eleanor's veterinary clinic, he knew he had made the right choice. The familiar scent of antiseptic and cedar shavings filled the air, mixed with the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The place was warm, inviting, a stark contrast to the cold and chaos Matthew had been living with ever since he'd taken in Aiden. Eleanor was at the counter, her back to him as she sorted through paperwork. She didn't notice him at first, and Matthew took a moment to study her. Time had been kind to her. Her auburn hair, now a little longer, was tied in a loose bun, and her green eyes, though tired, still held the same sharp intelligence he had always admired. She was a woman who had seen the worst life had to offer, yet still stood tall, ready to help those in need. He cleared his throat, and she turned her face, breaking into a tired but warm smile. "Matthew?" she said, her voice full of surprise but also a hint of relief. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Yeah," Matthew replied, shifting uncomfortably. He had always kept his distance from her since he returned to Bangor. He wasn't good at letting people in, especially after everything that had happened. But now, with Aiden's future hanging in the balance, he needed her help more than ever. "I need to talk to you about something important." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Come on in. Let's talk." They moved to the back of the clinic where Eleanor often did her consultations. The room was cozy, with a large table in the center surrounded by shelves filled with medical supplies and books. Matthew sat down, and after a moment of hesitation, he explained the situation, the strange men who had come looking for Aiden the microchip, the signs that there was more to this little dog than met the eye. Eleanor listened intently, her face growing more serious with every word. When Matthew finished, she took a deep breath, her fingers tapping gently on the table. "There's something you need to understand," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "Aiden, he's not just a stray. His behavior, the way he reacts to certain things, the microchip, you're right. This dog might be a part of something much bigger than we thought." Matthew frowned, trying to process her words. "What are you saying?" Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Aiden could be connected to a military program, a K-9 unit program specifically designed for rescue missions or even combat training. I've seen similar cases before. Dogs trained to perform complex tasks, tracking, locating survivors, or even being deployed for military operations. But this is different. Matthew's chest tightened. He could feel the old wounds, the ones left by Valor's death, begin to reopen. He had seen firsthand what these military-trained dogs were capable of. They were bred for strength, discipline, and loyalty. Valor had been one of them. I've seen dogs like Aiden before. Eleanor continued, trained for specialized operations, often in military settings. But when they're discarded, when their purpose is no longer needed, it's like they're forgotten, abandoned. Matthew's mind raced. He had always known that Valor had been different. The bond between them had been forged in the heat of battle. But now with Aiden, it was like the same pattern was repeating itself. Aiden had been discarded just like Valor had been after his service. "I didn't realize how deep this went," Matthew muttered, running a hand through his hair. His thoughts turned inward, back to the war, to Valor, to the constant fight for survival. "I see the connection," Eleanor said softly. "Aiden's been through something similar. He's not just a random stray. He's been trained, and now someone's looking for him. And we need to find out why." Matthew nodded, his mind made up. He could no longer stay passive. He had to uncover the truth about Aiden's past, whatever secrets the little dog was hiding, whatever connections to military operations. Matthew wasn't going to let it go. He couldn't. The air in Eleanor's clinic felt thick with tension as Matthew sat across from her, his mind racing. Every moment since he'd brought Aiden into his life had led him to this point, this search for the truth. What had happened to Aiden? Who had abandoned him, and why? The men who had come looking for the puppy had made it clear that there was more at play than just a simple case of a lost dog. "Where do we even start?" Matthew asked, running a hand through his hair. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her eyes focused on the small piece of paper she'd been scribbling on. "I think we start with what we know," she said softly. "Aiden's behavior, the microchip, the men who came looking for him. This isn't just about a stray dog. This is bigger." Matthew nodded, his fingers still tight around the edges of the chipped microchip he'd found earlier. "We need to find the people who trained him, figure out where he came from. There's a reason they're looking for him. And it's not just to rescue him. He's a part of something secret." Eleanor's expression hardened. "I've heard rumors about military K-9 programs, specialized dogs trained for covert operations. Some of them get discarded when their work is done, left to fend for themselves. Others, like Aiden, are sometimes retrieved, reconditioned, and put back into the system." Matthew's stomach churned. He couldn't imagine Aiden being part of something like that, a pawn in a larger, darker game. But it seemed like the pieces were all starting to align. Aiden had been trained, and now someone was searching for him. "I know where we can start," Eleanor said, her voice low but steady. "I heard about a place, an old facility on the outskirts of town. It used to be a training ground for K-9 units before it was shut down. It's been abandoned for years, but rumors persist. Some people say the place was used for more than just training." Matthew stood up, the decision already made. "Let's go. We need to find out what happened there." The drive to the old facility was long and silent, the world outside the truck window a blur of white snow and gray skies. Matthew's mind raced with thoughts of what they might find. Aiden, curled up on the seat beside him, still looked fragile, but there was a strength in the puppy's eyes now. He could sense the urgency in Matthew's movements, the quiet determination that had returned. Matthew glanced at Eleanor, who sat beside him, her jaw set in determination. The facility loomed ahead, a crumbling structure that had once been a place of purpose but now stood abandoned, slowly being swallowed by nature. The metal gates that once served as the entrance were rusted and broken, and the tall fences that had once kept the dogs inside now lay bent and twisted. The entire place seemed like a ghost of its former self. Matthew parked the truck just outside the entrance, his eyes scanning the area. The place felt deserted, but there was an unsettling stillness about it. The air was thick with the scent of old wood rust and decay. It was the kind of place that had been abandoned but never truly left behind. The kind of place that held secrets. Secrets that had been buried for years. Eleanor climbed out of the truck, her boots crunching in the snow as she made her way toward the entrance. Matthew followed closely behind Aiden by his side, the puppy alert and tense. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence, the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. Inside the compound, the remnants of old cages and training equipment were scattered around, broken and left to rot. The place had once been bustling with activity, dogs, trainers, the sound of commands and exercises. But now it was nothing more than a forgotten shell slowly being reclaimed by nature. But as they ventured further into the facility, the signs of something darker began to reveal themselves. Matthew spotted old marks on the walls, scratches that seemed out of place, as if something had been chained there, held against its will. He saw remnants of old faded food containers, torn bags that still smelled faintly of chemicals and processed dog food. And then there were the cages. They weren't just empty, they were twisted, bent in ways that suggested they had been used for something far darker than training. "This isn't just a training facility," Eleanor said quietly, her voice filled with disbelief. This place was used for something else." Matthew's gut twisted as he realized the truth. Aiden had been part of this, part of something brutal, something that used these dogs for purposes Matthew couldn't even begin to imagine. Matthew and Eleanor had barely begun to process the horrors of the abandoned facility when they heard it. The sound of tires crunching against the snow, distant but unmistakable. Matthew's head snapped toward the entrance, his hand instinctively going to the sidearm he had tucked into his jacket. The sound of an approaching vehicle was getting closer, its engine rumbling through the silence of the facility. "Who the hell is that?" Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. Matthew's pulse quickened as he scanned the area. The facility was isolated. There were no other vehicles in sight when they arrived, no sign of anyone having been here recently. But now the distinct rumble of a truck engine broke the stillness, and Matthew felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Get Aiden!" Matthew barked, his voice tight with urgency. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She scooped Aiden into her arms, cradling the puppy close to her chest as she moved quickly toward the back of the compound, away from the entrance. Matthew followed, his eyes scanning the surrounding buildings, looking for a place to hide a way out. The truck's tires slid to a stop just outside the compound gates, and Matthew heard the sound of doors opening, followed by the low murmur of voices. His instincts kicked in. He knew they didn't have much time. These men weren't here for a friendly visit. They were here to take Aiden, and Matthew wouldn't let that happen, not again. "Go!" he hissed at Eleanor, pushing her forward. They ran toward a small storage building at the far end of the lot, hoping to make it to cover before they were spotted. Aiden whimpered softly in Eleanor's arms, his small body trembling as if sensing the danger. Matthew's mind raced as he kept pace with Eleanor, but his thoughts kept circling back to the men. The way they had spoken about Aiden, the way they had recognized him. This wasn't just about a dog. There was something much bigger at play, something that Matthew hadn't fully understood. But one thing was clear: Aiden was important, and whoever was after him wouldn't stop until they had him back. They reached the storage building and ducked behind it, pressing their backs to the cold metal wall. Matthew peeked around the corner, his heart hammering in his chest. He could see the men now moving toward the entrance of the compound. They were wearing heavy coats, their faces obscured by shadows, but Matthew could tell from their posture and movements that they were organized, trained. These weren't just random people. They were coming for Aiden. Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps, and Matthew knew she was just as terrified as he was, but he couldn't afford to let fear take over now. They had to move, and fast. He checked the surrounding area for any other potential escape routes. The truck was blocking the main entrance, and the only other way out was through a narrow alleyway that led into the woods. Matthew looked down at Aiden, who had stopped shaking, his small eyes wide and alert. The puppy seemed to understand what was happening, his body tense in Eleanor's arms, ready for whatever might come next. "We have to go," Matthew said, his voice low. "Now." Without another word, they bolted for the alleyway, running as fast as they could through the snow. But as they reached the edge of the compound, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching in the snow reached their ears. The men were closing in. Matthew's heart raced as the realization hit him. There was no turning back now. They were in this fight whether they were ready or not. Matthew and Eleanor darted through the narrow alleyway, the cold air stinging their lungs as they ran. Their footsteps were muffled by the thick snow, but the sound of boots crunching through the snow behind them was unmistakable. The men were gaining on them. They had no choice but to keep running, but Matthew knew they couldn't outrun them forever. He turned to look at Eleanor, her face pale with fear but determined. Aiden was still in her arms, his tiny body pressed tightly against her chest, his fur damp with the cold sweat of fear. "Keep going," Matthew whispered urgently, his voice low but steady. He needed a plan, but his mind was moving too quickly to settle on anything clear. The only thing he knew was that they had to protect Aiden, no matter the cost. The alley led into a small thicket of trees, a brief moment of cover before the woods opened up into a clearing. The heavy snow hung like a blanket, muffling their footsteps, but it was only a matter of time before the men would catch up. They weren't far behind. As they reached the clearing, Matthew spotted an abandoned shed in the distance, something that might offer a brief respite. He took a deep breath and nodded at Eleanor. "We make for that shed," he said. "Stay close." They began to move toward the shed, but just as they were halfway there, the unmistakable sound of a voice called out behind them, "Stop right there!" Matthew's heart leaped into his throat. He spun around, his instincts kicking in. Two of the men had emerged from the edge of the alleyway, their guns raised and their faces hard with determination. Matthew's mind raced. He had to act fast. There was no running now, no more hiding. The men were still some distance away, but it was close enough. Matthew could see the cold, calculating looks in their eyes. They weren't just after a dog, they were after something bigger. Aiden was a key to something, and these men would stop at nothing to take him. Matthew's hand instinctively went to the small pistol he kept tucked under his jacket. His fingers closed around it, the cold metal grounding him for a moment. He knew the stakes. This wasn't just about getting away anymore. This was about fighting to protect Aiden, and not letting these men take him back to whatever dark purpose they had planned. "Get back!" Matthew shouted, his voice firm and commanding. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Aiden and the men. "You're not taking him." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions cold and unreadable. One of them stepped forward, a smile creeping across his face. "You really think you can stop us, Marine?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Matthew stood tall, his jaw set, his fingers tightening around the pistol. He was ready. He wouldn't back down. Not this time. The tension was palpable, the world feeling like it had slowed to a crawl. In that moment, Matthew felt the weight of his past. Valor, the promises he had made, the battles he had fought. He couldn't afford to fail again. Not now, not with Aiden. The first man lunged forward, but Matthew was quicker. He sidestepped, grabbing the man's arm and using his momentum against him. The man stumbled, his gun slipping from his hand, and Matthew didn't hesitate. He knocked the weapon away, disarming the man with a quick, fluid motion. The second man lunged at Matthew, but Eleanor, her face set with newfound determination, shoved him back with all her strength. Aiden let out a sharp bark, his tiny body alert and ready to defend. Matthew fought the second man off, using his body weight to push him against the nearby shed. A struggle ensued, but Matthew's combat instincts kicked in. He fought with the precise, calculated aggression of a soldier. He knew how to defend. He had done it 1,000 times before, and this time it was for something that mattered. With a final push, Matthew sent the second man crashing to the ground. He stood over him, breathing heavily, his heart pounding. The first man who had regained his footing hesitated, his eyes now wary. Matthew took a step forward, positioning himself between the man and Aiden. "This is your last warning," Matthew said, his voice low, filled with the authority of a man who had fought in wars and survived. "Stay away from him." The men, battered and on the ground, looked up at him with frustration and recognition in their eyes. They knew they had lost this round. With a glance, they retreated, backing away into the shadows. Matthew exhaled slowly, his body still tense, his heart still racing. They were safe. For now. As Matthew stood there watching the men retreat into the shadows, his breath still coming in sharp, ragged gasps, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The fight had been brutal, but it had only confirmed what Matthew had already suspected. Aiden was more than just a stray puppy. Someone somewhere wanted him back. And whatever that someone was, they weren't just interested in a simple rescue. Eleanor, who had been standing behind Matthew, her breath shallow from the chaos, stepped forward, her voice low but urgent. "We need to find out exactly who these men are and what they're after." Matthew nodded, his eyes still scanning the distance, making sure no one else was approaching. "They'll be back," he muttered. "And next time they won't be alone." The sound of snow crunching under their boots echoed in the silence as they turned and made their way back to the truck. Aiden was still in Eleanor's arms, his tiny body still trembling, but now more alert, his eyes darting nervously around them. Matthew could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The puppy wasn't just a stray, it was something much more, something that had been hidden in the shadows for far too long, and Matthew was about to uncover it. The drive back to the cabin was silent. Eleanor, her eyes focused on the road, was deep in thought. Matthew's mind, however, was racing. The men, those soldiers, were connected to something bigger, something dark. They weren't here just for Aiden. They were part of a larger network, one that was involved in military operations, a network that had its hands in everything from covert missions to experiments on animals. He could feel it, the weight of the truth beginning to settle in. Eleanor broke the silence as they pulled into the cabin's driveway. "I've been doing some research," she said, her voice tight, "about military canine programs, about dogs like Aiden. There's been talk about dogs being used for operations, special units where they're trained for everything from search and rescue to attack missions. But there's more. Things that I'm not sure I should even be telling you." Matthew turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean? What's going on?" Eleanor sighed, her shoulders slumping. "There are programs, underground operations that use dogs for experiments to enhance their abilities to turn them into weapons. And I think Aiden was part of one of those programs." Matthew felt a chill run down his spine. The words echoed in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Aiden, his loyal little puppy, wasn't just a victim of abandonment. He had been subjected to something far worse. "Are you saying they were using him as a weapon?" Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded grimly. "It's more than that. It's about control, about creating animals that can do more than any normal dog could. They train them to be faster, stronger, and more obedient. But the cost is their humanity, or in Aiden's case, his spirit." Matthew clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him. Aiden had been part of a military experiment trained to be a tool in someone else's war. He wasn't just a casualty of neglect. He had been used. And now someone wanted him back. Someone who wasn't done with him yet. But as Matthew looked down at Aiden curled up in Eleanor's arms, a new determination washed over him. He had no idea how deep this went, how far-reaching the organization was. But one thing was certain, Aiden was worth more than anyone could ever imagine. He wasn't just a trained weapon, he was a survivor. And Matthew was going to make sure he stayed that way. The cabin was quiet save for the soft crackle of the fire and the rhythmic breathing of Aiden in Eleanor's arms, but within Matthew the storm raged. The weight of everything he had just learned, about Aiden's past, about the horrors he had endured, and the truth of the military program that had created him, felt suffocating. The guilt, the rage, the need for revenge, he felt it all in equal measure. But underneath it all was something deeper, something he hadn't anticipated: fear. Fear of what this meant for him. Fear of what it meant for Aiden. Matthew had always been a protector. That was his role. Whether on the battlefield or back home, he had dedicated himself to safeguarding others. He had done it for Valor, and now he was doing it for Aiden. But with the revelations about Aiden's past, Matthew was faced with an overwhelming question. Was he protecting Aiden from the people who had abandoned him, or was he dragging the puppy deeper into a world of violence and danger that Matthew had barely survived himself? The idea of fighting for Aiden, of taking on whoever was behind the military program, felt like the right thing to do. But at the same time, the weight of his past, the years of trauma and loss, made him question whether he was truly the right person for the task. Could he fight for Aiden without losing himself in the process? Could he protect this dog from the monsters chasing him without becoming a monster himself? Matthew stood by the window, looking out into the snow, his fingers trembling as they rested against the cold glass. The night was silent, but his thoughts were loud, echoing with doubts. Was he willing to sacrifice everything again? Was it worth it? You're not alone in this. Eleanor's voice broke through his thoughts, gentle but firm. Matthew turned to her, his eyes filled with confusion and frustration. I don't know what to do, Eleanor. Aiden, he's been through hell, and now he's in danger again. The things we've learned, the people after him, they won't stop. They never stop. Eleanor set Aiden down gently, watching him curl up in his blanket on the floor, and then walked over to Matthew. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady, unwavering. Matthew, I get it. I know the weight of the decisions you're facing. You're carrying the weight of your past, the ghosts of what happened to you and Valor, and now you've got Aiden in your hands. But you're not in this alone. We're in this together. Matthew's heart clenched. He had never been good at accepting help. It was easier to carry the burden on his own, to push others away so they wouldn't have to share the weight of his pain. But now, with Eleanor standing beside him, he realized that maybe he didn't have to do this by himself. You don't understand, Matthew whispered, his voice rough. Every time I've tried to protect someone, it's ended in disaster. Valor, I couldn't save him. I couldn't save anyone. I'm not sure I can do this again. Eleanor's eyes softened and she took a step closer. You can't change what happened in the past, Matthew, but you can change what happens now. Aiden is here. You're here. And maybe, just maybe, this is your chance to make it right, not just for Aiden, but for yourself, too. Matthew looked down at Aiden, the puppy's tiny body still curled up on the blanket, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. A sense of calm washed over him, the storm inside his chest slowly settling. He could see the determination in Eleanor's eyes, the quiet strength that had always been her gift. She believed in him. And that belief, no matter how small, was enough to pull him from the brink of doubt. He nodded slowly, the decision weighing on him, but the uncertainty beginning to fade. He had been running from his past for so long, but maybe it was time to face it. Maybe it was time to fight not just for Aiden, but for himself. As the days passed, Aiden's recovery seemed nothing short of miraculous. What started as a fragile, trembling puppy barely able to lift his head had transformed into a small but determined fighter. Matthew had watched the changes with awe. Each day, Aiden's strength grew. The once downtrodden dog began to show more signs of life, his eyes brightening and his body growing stronger with each passing moment. But it wasn't just his physical recovery that impressed Matthew. It was the quiet determination that Aiden displayed, something that Matthew recognized instantly. It was the same spirit that had made Valor stand tall in the face of danger, the same fire that burned in every dog trained for survival. One afternoon, as Matthew and Eleanor worked around the cabin, Aiden was playing in the yard, his small body now bounding with energy. Matthew noticed the puppy stop suddenly, ears pricked and eyes alert. A deep growl rumbled from Aiden's throat, low and menacing, as he stood stock still staring at something in the distance. His body was tense muscles coiled, ready for action. Matthew froze, a sense of unease creeping up his spine. Eleanor followed his gaze, and together they saw the shadow of a figure emerging from the tree line. We're not alone, Matthew muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. He watched as Aiden's stance shifted, the puppy's small body rigid and poised. Aiden's growl grew louder, and before Matthew could say a word, the puppy was already moving, swift and precise, darting toward the figure, with an agility that Matthew hadn't expected from such a small dog. The man in the distance barely had time to react as Aiden lunged at him, barking fiercely. Matthew was right behind him, his eyes wide with surprise. He had known Aiden had potential, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. The puppy moved with the instinct and precision of a trained soldier, knocking the man off balance with his powerful bite. The man stumbled, trying to grab at Aiden, but the puppy wasn't done. He darted to the side, coming at the man from behind, biting the man's leg hard enough to make him shout out in pain. Matthew rushed in, grabbing the man's wrist and pulling him away, but Aiden didn't back down. The puppy remained protective, standing firm between Matthew and the man, as if instinctively aware of the danger the intruder posed. "Get back!" Matthew said, his voice firm as he stepped between Aiden and the man, pulling the dog back with one hand. The man, still on the ground, groaned in pain but didn't move to fight back. "What the hell do you want?" Matthew growled, his eyes hard as he glared at the man. The stranger's face was pale with shock, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "We just wanted the dog," he said, his voice strained with pain. "Not happening," Matthew snapped. "You'll never get him." Aiden's eyes never left the man, still growling low, his body poised and ready to strike if needed. The puppy's loyalty and protective instincts were undeniable. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was a warrior, a survivor ready to protect those he loved. As the man reluctantly stood up, Matthew held Aiden close to his side, feeling the puppy's small but strong body trembling with adrenaline. "This isn't over," the man said, his voice full of warning. "You've made a mistake." Matthew didn't flinch. "You're the one who's made the mistake." The tension in the air was thick, like a storm that had yet to break. The man, now on his feet but still nursing the pain from Aiden's bite, glared at Matthew and the puppy with a look that could kill. But there was something in his eyes, a hint of recognition, maybe even fear. He knew Aiden wasn't just some stray, and it was becoming painfully obvious that he wasn't the only one searching for the dog. A sharp sound in the distance, the hum of an approaching vehicle, cut through the silence. Matthew turned instinctively, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He could feel the weight of the situation closing in around them. "They're here," the man muttered under his breath, his words barely audible, but Matthew heard them clearly. "What's going on?" Eleanor asked, her voice tight with unease, standing just behind Matthew. She was holding Aiden protectively in her arms now, the puppy still alert, his body rigid with tension. Matthew knew the situation had escalated beyond what they could handle alone. The truck that had arrived was familiar, a dark black SUV that Matthew recognized from a previous encounter, the same men who had been searching for Aiden. They stepped out to the sound of their boots crunching in the snow like a drumbeat that signaled the arrival of danger. The leader of the group, a man Matthew hadn't seen before, had an air of authority about him, his posture straight, his expression cold and calculating. He didn't even look at Matthew. His eyes were on Aiden, locked in with a look of possession. "Where is it?" the man said, his voice low and commanding. Matthew's gut twisted with a mix of fear and anger. "Not here," Matthew growled. "You won't get your hands on him." The man's lips curled into a cold smile. "You really don't understand what's happening here, do you?" He stepped closer, and Matthew could see the weight of his words. There was a deep, threatening calm in his eyes. "Aiden belongs to us. He's part of something much bigger than you can imagine." Matthew's grip on his gun tightened. His heart hammered in his chest as the truth began to click into place. This wasn't just some random rescue. Aiden was part of a program, a secret military operation. He had been trained, conditioned for something far darker. Matthew's mind flashed back to the conversation he had had with Eleanor, the signs that Aiden was more than just a dog, and now it all made sense. "He's more than just a weapon," Matthew said, his voice hardening with each word. "He's a survivor. You're not taking him." The man's expression darkened, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he motioned to his team. The air thickened with the silent threat of what was about to happen. Matthew knew that this was the point of no return. Aiden had already proven he could fight. The bond between them, forged in silence and shared history, had turned this little puppy into something more than just a pet. He was a fighter, and Matthew wasn't going to let these people use him again. We've been trying to recover all of the assets, including Aiden. The man continued, his tone still cold. He's part of a classified operation, a weapon trained for special assignments. But now he's a liability, a loose end. We don't leave those behind. Matthew stepped forward, putting himself between the man and Aiden. Then you'll have to go through me first. The man's face darkened, and for a moment Matthew thought he saw a flicker of something, resentment, anger, but also recognition. Recognition of the type of man standing in front of him, a man who had fought in the same shadows they were trying to control. There was a long pause before the man finally spoke again, his voice quieter but still dripping with disdain. "You're making a mistake, Marine. You don't know what you're up against." Matthew didn't flinch. "I'm not the one making the mistake." The tension in the air was so thick it felt like the world had frozen in that single moment. The man's cold gaze never left Matthew as they stood face to face, both unwavering, neither willing to step aside. Matthew's mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, determination. But above all, it was filled with a fierce protectiveness for Aiden. This was no longer just about saving a dog. It was about standing up to an entire system, a monstrous organization that used lives, both human and animal, as mere tools. Aiden, sensing the danger, stood alert beside Matthew, his small body rigid with tension. He was still a puppy, fragile and weak, but his spirit was undeniable. Matthew couldn't help but feel a deep, overwhelming bond between them, one that had grown stronger with each passing day. He had sworn to protect this little creature just as he had once sworn to protect his brothers in arms in the military. And now, standing before this man, Matthew knew what he had to do. The man's eyes narrowed. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his voice low but filled with threat. "You don't know the people you're up against. This isn't just about you or that dog. There's much more at stake here." Matthew's chest tightened, the weight of the man's words settling on his shoulders. But he didn't back down. He couldn't. Aiden had already suffered enough, and Matthew wasn't about to let these people drag him back into that hellish existence. He looked at Eleanor standing just behind him, her face pale, but filled with resolve. She had always been the calm in the storm, the steady hand that had guided him through the worst of times, but even she knew what was at stake now. This wasn't just about saving Aiden. It was about stopping a system that would keep using and discarding lives without a second thought. "We'll fight," Matthew said, his voice firm, a promise echoing in the stillness of the moment. "We'll fight to protect Aiden and every dog that's been used and discarded by people like you." The man's lips curled into a bitter smile. "So be it," he said coldly. "You're all in this now, and you'll regret it." Suddenly, a group of men emerged from the trees, their presence making the air feel even heavier. Matthew and Eleanor stood their ground, Aiden now positioned protectively between them. Matthew's mind raced as he assessed their options. The odds were against them, but he wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. A tense silence lingered for a moment before Matthew made his move. He motioned for Eleanor to back away slightly, putting Aiden out of harm's way. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but he knew it wasn't the weapon he needed most in this fight. It was the resolve in his heart, the promise he had made to Valor, and now to Aiden. "I won't let you take him," Matthew said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable determination. The moment hung in the air, like a fragile thread about to snap. And then everything exploded into motion. In a blur, Matthew and the men clashed. It wasn't just a physical fight, it was the fight for something more, for freedom, for the right to protect the innocent. Aiden barked, his small body darting forward, biting at the ankles of the men who tried to approach Matthew. The puppy's instincts were sharp, and though he was small, his courage was undeniable. Eleanor too stood firm, her eyes scanning for any opening to strike. Matthew fought with everything he had, his body moving with the precision of someone who had fought wars before. But this was different. This wasn't about survival, it was about something bigger. The right to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Every punch he threw, every move he made was for Aiden, for the other dogs trapped in the system, and for the memory of Valor who had given everything. It was a brutal fight, but it didn't last long. The men, realizing they were outmatched and outwitted, retreated. Matthew stood panting, his body bruised but unbroken. Aiden stood beside him, tail wagging as if he had been part of the fight too, his small body full of the same spirit that had kept him alive all this time. The sun rose over Bangor, casting its first warm light on a town that seemed to be waking up from a long, cold slumber. Snow still covered the ground, but the bitter chill of winter had begun to loosen its grip. The storm that had plagued Matthew, Aiden, and Eleanor had passed, leaving behind a sense of calm that felt unfamiliar but welcome. Matthew stood outside the small house he had rented, his hand resting gently on Aiden's back. The puppy was no longer the fragile, trembling creature he had rescued from the snowstorm weeks ago. Aiden now walked with a confident gait, his tail wagging freely as he explored the yard, his eyes filled with wonder and trust. Matthew had never imagined he would find peace here, not after everything that had happened, after Valor, after the wars, after the betrayal. He had lived with the scars of war for so long, the wounds too deep to heal. But somehow, standing in the warm light of the morning with Aiden by his side, Matthew felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. Aiden had become his anchor, his reason to keep moving forward. The little puppy, who had been subjected to so much cruelty, had found his way into Matthew's heart in a way no one else had. And now Matthew was determined to give Aiden the life he deserved, a life of freedom, love, and safety. The house was small, modest, but it was theirs. Matthew had worked hard to make it a home, filling it with the simple comforts that had eluded him for so long. The walls were decorated with pictures, and there was the faint smell of fresh bread and coffee in the air. It wasn't much, but it was everything they needed. Eleanor had been a constant presence throughout the journey, her support unwavering. After the fight with the men and the threat that had loomed over them, Eleanor had stayed close, helping Matthew and Aiden settle into their new life. She had been there every step of the way, offering comfort, guidance, and strength. And now, as Matthew and Aiden began to embrace their new life, Eleanor had become more than just a friend. She was family. As the day wore on, Matthew and Aiden took a walk through the small town, the puppy's tiny paws crunching against the snow. People smiled as they passed by, their eyes warm and welcoming. There was no judgment here, no fear, just acceptance. Matthew had always been the outsider, the man haunted by his past, but here in this small town, he was starting to feel like he belonged. The door to the community center opened and families spilled out onto the street, some with children, some with rescued dogs. It was a gathering Matthew had been hesitant to attend, but now he saw it for what it was, a place of healing. Aiden's ears perked up as he saw the other dogs, and without hesitation he bounded toward them, his playful energy infectious. Matthew watched his heart swelling with pride and relief. Aiden was happy here, surrounded by people who cared and other dogs who had been saved from similar fates. Matthew looked over at Eleanor, who stood beside him watching with a smile. "You did it," she said softly. "You gave him a chance." Matthew nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "We both did." He whispered, his gaze lingering on Aiden, now happily playing with the other dogs. In that moment, Matthew knew he had found redemption, not just for himself, but for Aiden too. The past had tried to hold them both captive, but now they were free. They had been given a second chance, a new life, a new beginning. Aiden came running back to Matthew, his tail wagging furiously, and the puppy leaped up into his arms. Matthew laughed, and his heart lighter than it had been in years. He pressed a kiss to Aiden's head, feeling the warmth of the little dog's body against his chest. A new life. Matthew whispered, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Together. The world outside was vast and uncertain, but for the first time Matthew felt ready to face it. There would be challenges ahead, but with Aiden by his side, he knew he could handle anything. This was their new beginning. No longer soldiers or weapons, but simply two survivors living in the warmth of unconditional love and the freedom to choose their own path. As the story of Matthew and Aiden unfolds, it becomes a powerful reminder of the resilience and loyalty that define the German Shepherd breed. Aiden, once a victim of abandonment and abuse, rises above his past with the help of Matthew's unwavering love and protection. This tale illustrates that animals, especially those who have faced the harshest of circumstances, deserve the chance to heal and live in a world filled with kindness. At its core, this story speaks to the value of unconditional love, not only between humans, but also between humans and animals. The bond that grows between Matthew and Aiden, forged through mutual respect and care, transcends the barriers of pain and trauma. Aiden, with his courage and spirit, teaches us all the importance of second chances, just as Matthew learns to heal from the scars of his past. Aiden's journey toward recovery is a testament to the strength of animals, their capacity for trust, and their ability to bring out the best in those around them. The story also highlights the profound connection between humans and animals, reminding us that every life, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, holds immense value. By choosing to protect and love those who cannot speak for themselves, we honor the deeper meaning of compassion, loyalty, and empathy. Matthew and Aiden's new life together serves as a shining example of what can happen when love and care are given freely, teaching us that with kindness we all have the power to change a life, whether human or animal.